We're moving on to task 2, which involves changing the flow of execution. And we do that using selection structures like if statements or repetition structures like while loops. So this is task number 2. And the first thing that our boss wants us to do is delete the invoice copy table if it exists, and delete the customer temporary table if it exists. And so quite often an if statement is used for this because you check to see if the object, the database object, is not null. If it's not null, in this case, we would drop the tables. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pause this while I key in the code. So you can see we are using object ID, and then the name of our object is invoice copy. The name of our temporary table is tempdb ... ## customers. Okay, and remember, a global temporary table, which is what this is available to everyone if it exists. So I'm going to run this. I don't think they exist, but the commands did complete successfully. So if the tables were there, they are now gone. And let's move our closing comment down. And our next task. Our boss would like us to display the order ID, the product ID, and the total price, which is the unit price times the quantity, for Northwind data. And the data is in our order detail table. They'd like to see information for the 10 highest total price orders. Okay, so that does indicate we want a top value. There's a couple different ways we can do this. One technique would be to sort in descending order by total price, and then use a while loop to count the first 10. And because we are looking at if statements and while loops, that is the technique that we are going to use. And if you want to process row by row, which is what we need to do, we have to use something called a row cursor. A row cursor lets us access individual rows instead of the entire result set. So first of all, we're going to tell it that we want to use Northwind. Okay, and we'll go ahead and say go here. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to declare our counter variable. So this is the one that's going to keep track of the number of rows that we've retrieved. And remember, we only want 10. So we're going to declare, and we're just going to call it counter integer, and we're going to set that equal to 1. So our starting value is going to be 1. And then because we need to process row by row, we are going to be declaring a cursor. And so what you end up doing is you declare a cursor for the result of a select query. And our select query needs to retrieve the order ID, the product ID, total price, which is unit price times quantity. And that's coming from order details, where that total price is greater than 100. We need to make sure that we sort that result set by the total price in descending order. So I'm going to pause this while I key that in. So here's the select that we want to run. And we want to access each row. So we declare this row cursor. We say it is a cursor for the result set that we get when we run this select. So once we create the cursor for a select, we have to open it in order to use it. So our next statement is going to be to open the row cursor. And then we want to retrieve a row using our row cursor. And we're going to keep retrieving the rows until there aren't any left. So we're going to get into a while loop, and we need to check something called the fetch status. Okay, so we said fetch next, and so it's going to keep retrieving the next row, and the fetch status indicates if we're done or not. If we're done, it is going to equal a 0. Or if we're not done, it's going to equal 0. If we are done, it is set to a different value. So while the fetch status is equal to 0, we can keep retrieving the rows. And so the syntax here for the while loop is you start with begin and you end with end. And then in between is the code that you want to loop. And so we want it to fetch next from row cursor. And we're going to set our counter equal to the counter plus 1. Now, the counter was initialized to 1 because we retrieved a row here and we didn't add anything to the counter. Okay, so the counter started at 1 and that kind of accounted for this. Now we retrieved another row, so we have to add to the counter. So if our counter is greater than or equal to 10, then we're done, right? Because we said we only wanted to retrieve 10. So we need to break out of here. Okay. Otherwise, if it is not greater than or equal to 10, we have to keep retrieving rows. Okay, so we just want it to continue looping. And how this works is it retrieves one row at a time and it displays it. So from this first fetch next, you're going to see a row. From the second one, you'll see another row. Okay, then it's at this point, the counter is a 2. It's not greater than or equal to 10. So it continues. So it goes back up to the top of the loop and it retrieves a third row, adds one to the counter, checks it, goes down to the continue. And it keeps doing that until we actually have the counter at 10. Once the counter is at 10, when we come through here and we add one to it, it's going to make it 11. So at that point, the counter is going to be greater than 10, and it should break out. Now, it should also break out when it is 10. Okay, so once it's 9, and we come down here and we read another row, and it becomes 10, it is greater than or equal to 10, right? 10 is equal to 10, so it should break out. And what happens is it goes to the line below the end. So the line below the end, what we're going to do here is close the row cursor. And then we have to deallocate it so it frees up our resources. We're not using it, so we don't need those computer resources tied up. So this is kind of our long little script, and we're going to go ahead and execute it. And you can see each time it retrieves. Okay, so this was from the first fetch, and then it got into the loop, and it did this one all the way down to the last one, in which case the counter would have been 10. So it popped down here, closed it, and deallocated it. And if you want to verify that it ran 10 times, if you come over to messages and you count where it says one row affected, there should be 10 of them here. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. And our next little scenario. Our boss would like us to create a script to back up the master database file. We're going to place the files into a temporary folder that should be on the C drive. So before running our code, we got to check our C drive to make sure there's a folder called temp. Because if it's not there, we need to create it. So you can see that we are going to be creating several variables. One called name, which is going to be the name of the database. One is called path, and this is going to be the path where we're going to put our backup files. File name is going to be the name for the backup file, and file date is actually going to be used in conjunction with the name. Then you can see we're setting our path to that temporary folder on the C drive. And the file date, we're getting the current date and we're converting it into character. We are using a row cursor for this. We are selecting the name from our master sys databases table. And we don't want to back up any of the database files that are named master model MSDB or tempdb. We want our own database files. So this kind of excludes those system database files. Okay, so this is a row cursor for this select. We're going to open up the row cursor, and then we fetch the first database that we're actually going to be backing up. And as long as we have database files, okay, so as long as there is something there, we are going to set our new file name, the backup name, to the path plus the name plus the date, and then we tack back onto the end. Okay, and then we give it a command to back up the database, and this is the name of the one we're backing up, to disk. We set that equal to the new name, the file name. And then we fetch the next one. Okay, and it's going to keep going through this as long as you have a database that doesn't start with master model MSDB or tempdb. So once it's done, it's going to close the cursor and deallocate it. Depending on how many databases you are, this can take a while. If you don't have a lot of databases, then it won't take too long. So I'm going to pause this while I get the code in here, and then I'm going to run it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this little select. It is selecting from sys databases so we can get an idea of how many it's going to be backing up. And we are excluding master, temp, model, and MSDB. So these first four are not going to be backed up. It's just the ones below it. Okay, so that's not too bad. Okay, so I'm going to move my closing comment down. Now I'm going to remove the comments from the section that I want to execute for the backups. And we've already talked about what this code does. I am going to verify that I have a temp folder on my C drive, because that would be bad if I did not. It would actually not work. So there's my C drive. I'm pretty sure I do have a temp folder, and I do. So that should work. Let me see what it's looking for temp. Okay, it's looking at a lowercase t, and I have an uppercase. So I'm just going to change that just in case. And now I'm going to go ahead and execute it. And you can see down here it's executing. And depending on how many databases you have, it can take a while. So I'm going to pause the video and I'll come back when it's done. Hey, I am seeing some output now. And you can see how much it processed for AP. It says the backup was successful. Tells me how much time it took. And then here's my example database. Backup was successful, how much time it took. So it kind of goes through each one. I don't see any red, which is good because that indicates everything worked. And if I come over and open up my temp folder, I've actually done this in multiple classes. So yeah, I have a lot back here. And what it does is it tags on the date. So it takes the name of the database, and then it tacks on the underscore and the date with BAK on the end. Okay, so you can see the different times these backups were actually made. Okay, and I'm going to move the closing comment down. And we are going to be moving on to task 3.